Good afternoon and most welcome to Hising Island and a very sunny 1st of September. It is what we call in Sweden midsummer temperature, the same we are expected to experience in mid-July somewhere, so it's very pleasant. The only thing that tells us it's September, the sun is a bit lower on the sky, but apart from that, who can tell? It's September. The only downfall is for me as very fond of mushrooms. It is a disaster, but I'm really happy with the success we made with the different, well, I don't think we ever had such a big span of different subjects going in different directions. And I think that is inspired by Heraclitus himself. Unity in diversity, and the many and the one. I will today take up the body as a metaphor, and this is leaning into something that is radically different, and I would say it's not suggestible to jump directly into the Lakoff theory of embodied realism. It takes a time to accept, and well, to be illustrated from a different angle is his embodied realism led to the fearsome and very, very horrendous, belligerent attacks between his former master or supervisor, Professor Noam Chomsky, and George Lakoff himself. Such big is the difference. Too much harm to Chomsky, I would say, because the attacks were vicious, bit ringing close to what we experience in our own little society here in Gothenburg. That was crashed after a conflict over the subject of a certain quantum physical cat, whose name I will not mention. I start with a little article today here. It's from Stephen A. Fesmeyer from Southern Illinois University, and it's about, I would say, pneuma, or aerating the body, the metaphor of mental functioning as a bodily functioning. And this is a segue. I don't know if you know the segue expression.
Omväg, eller genväg.
Yeah, segue, but it's also, genväg in both senses. Both it is easier and it's associating, thereby making it easy to sort of stride into that. So I'm making a connection to the former Richard E. Lynn pneuma and the Greek philosophers of pneuma into the metaphorical thinking of Lakoff/Johnson. Otherwise, I would say it's too stern. And I have to admit, from my own point of view, it's too stern for me as well. I don't want to press myself. It becomes a little bit, well, it's like a bit like losing one's grip on earth somehow. But don't worry. Once you made the turn into embodied realism, there is no going back. You will prefer that. But it feels like you're losing your grip somehow. This should be parallel to a discussion we had yesterday with the signer of mathematical equations. The idea that somebody invented a certain mathematical equation, algorithm, or discovery, and he or she is the maker and therefore signed the thing. It sounds like making all the mathematics completely, I don't know, less of value or less objective. I argue already here, I will put my foot down and say it is not the case, it is just the opposite. But that takes some time to understand, because you need to go through the bodily change yourself. If you're not balanced, you need something else to balance on. If your intellect is not awakened, you need to say your thinking is somewhere else. Someone else is the owner of your thinker, although if that person is unnamed, anonymous as it is in modern discourse. But it's a safety for us. Once we go back to being balanced, being with our knowledge, being able to do intellectualization, be able to think. Something I mentioned earlier that David Bradel often points out, that thinking is a thing of the past. We cannot show up thinking in MRI scans or ECC readings. It shows really clearly if somebody really thinks or just copies. It's a huge difference. And it's a bit like cheating, I would say, but what can you do? If you don't access thinking or intellectualization, you don't have much choice. So let me cut to the chase and go into the article. The abstract I will read. Recent advances in the cognitive sciences suggest that cognition is grounded in our embodied experience. This article supports this claim by analyzing the way we conceptualize our emotions, metaphorically in terms of bodily processes. Our emotions are not merely matters of subjective feeling. Rather, emotions have stable conceptual structures that have emerged from our embodied activity through metaphorical projections. Structures that are shared in a culture and can be disclosed by empirical inquiry. This article explores the metaphorical structuring of anxiety in terms of our experience of breathing. The correlation in our experience between mental functioning and bodily functioning, which leads to the emergence of metaphorical understanding, is of special concern. This article elaborates on how features of our experience of inhibited breathing map onto our experience of mental disquietude. It draws on Johnson, Lakoff, Johnson, Reddy, and it borrows insights from James and Pearls. And I would like to add quantum physics. In quantum physics is the case, until a stated fact becomes embodied or metaphorical, it is not a fact. It is not a thing of the world. It needs to be metaphorical. Otherwise, it's transcendental. Yes, it's a bit harsh to say that, but it helps. Think of either transcendental, not of the world, not having the truth value true, being out there, something you just say, not pertaining to the real world, and versus embodied, metaphorical, that is of the world, of experience, being something that you can actually think, not just say or emptily repeat. I think that is the difference. Philosophers have traditionally severed cognition from our emotional lives, along the lines of a split between mind and the body. Nevertheless, the body of evidence emerging from the field of cognitive semantics argues for the embodiment of cognition, that our bodily experience, far from being peripheral to cognition, structures our cognitive activity. Image, schemata, categorization, metaphor, metonymy, narrative structures are among the phenomena through which the embodied mind or the minded body adjusts to its changing environment. Metaphor and metonymy are the focus here. Cognitive semantics shows that metaphor is central to our capacity for understanding, and that metaphorical structure is grounded in bodily experience. There is a vast metaphoric system that grounds our conception of mind and reasoning, whereby mental phenomena are understood in terms of bodily phenomena. Schweitzer named this the mind as body metaphor, observing that there is a general tendency to borrow concepts and vocabulary from the more accessible physical and social world to refer to the less accessible words of reasoning, emotion, and conversational structure. End of quote. Schweitzer's analysis suggests that, far from being irrelevant to abstract reasoning, patterns of our bodily experience actually structure our cognition. I investigate the emergence of mind as body metaphor, or more specifically its sub-metaphor. Mental functioning is bodily functioning. Through an analysis of one concrete example of our conceptualization of emotions, I explore how our understanding of anxiety is structured in terms of our experience of inhibited breathing. The primary focus is on distinctively physiological processes, although this by no means precludes non-physical basis for its intended support and non-physical basis for our metaphorical understanding of emotions. Furthermore, the article is intended to support, through a series of testable hypotheses, the thesis of most interpretation of cognitive semantics, that the grounding of metaphor in embodied activity is basic to our cognition. The terms body and bodily are used here to emphasize our physiological body. All this should not be understood to entail reduction of our bodily interaction with the environmental conditions to be merely physiological. Interesting problem there. Metonymy and metaphorical projections in our conceptualization of emotions. Emotions are often thought to be matters of subjective feeling only, lacking conceptual content. That is, no stable and shared structures are thought to exist through which we cognize our emotions, no structures that can be disclosed by empirical inquiry. For evidence that the prototype or folk model of emotion is that of mental feeling opposed to cognition, and therefore inappropriate to discussion of our conceptual schemes. Nevertheless, we not only feel emotions, we also seek to understand, organize, and reason about these feelings. Furthermore, when we act on our emotions, we act not only on the basis of feeling, but also on the basis of that understanding. Isolating emotions from human reason leaves us with an impoverished, one-dimensional view. From a neurophysiological perspective, it is mistaken to claim that our higher mental functions are exempt from disruptive emotions. For example, the root of much of our higher cognitive functions, the neocortex, is a source of some emotional experience through excitement of the hypothalamus. Over time, certain structures for understanding and organizing our feelings evolve. These patterns of interpretation are embedded in a social context, and they constrain and direct the way we give meaningful form to our feelings. To see what is involved here. Consider Lakoff's 87 detailed study of the conceptual structure of anger. He showed that the conventionalized folk understanding of the physiological accompaniments of anger has led to a system of metonymies in which the physiological effects of an emotion stand for the emotion. These metonymical structures, in turn, give rise to metaphorical projections. For example, body heat is the source of a metonymy for anger, as evidenced by the expression, "Don't get hot under the collar," and "They were having a heated argument." Interference with accurate perception has also come to stand for anger, as with "She was blind with rage." The metonymy of body heat for felt anger forms the basis of the most general metaphor for anger. Anger is heat. One version of the metaphor involves understanding anger as the heat of a fluid in a container, as in, "You make my blood boil," "Simmer down," or "I had reached the boiling point." Our knowledge of heated fluids in containers is projected onto and structures our understanding of anger, and therefore structures our interference about anger. We know, for example, that intense heat produces steam and creates pressure of the container. Expressions such as "She got all steamed up" and "Billy's just blowing off steam" are metaphorical entailments of our knowledge about steam production. Meanwhile, our knowledge about pressure yields such expressions as "He was bursting with anger" and "I could barely contain my rage." If the intensity of the anger increases too much, the result is inevitable. "When I told him, he just exploded." Lakoff's 87 study suggests that we understand our emotions through metonymic and metaphorical structures that emerge from our living, embodied encounter with the world. Consider the following emotions that are conceptualized metonymically, each in terms of one of its physiological accompaniments. When I'm confronted by racism, it makes my stomach turn. One of our conceptions of disgust is grounded in this bodily sensation, just as heat of anger can ground our conception of anger. In both examples, the bodily is immanent in the mental. Meanwhile, fear sends a chill down my spine and makes me tremble with fear. Lust makes us burn with desire. The swallowing that accompanies embarrassment makes us admit to swallowing our pride. In fact, our language about each of these emotions involves a conventionalized, selective emphasis on one or more of the prominent folk physiological accompaniments of the emotion. Consider some metaphors commonly associated with our experience of anxiety and their relation to disturbances in our physiological systems. The respiratory system, I'm suffocating. The circulatory system, especially cerebral blood flow, his head was pounding. The circulatory system, especially the her heart was racing. The somatosensory system, she sweated through the ordeal. The digestive system, he is wrenching with anxiety. I'm all in knots. And the skeletal system, I was weak in the knees. Note that these systems, far from being isolated from each other, are interlaced. In the experience of anxiety, for example, an increase in cerebral blood flow corresponds to fluctuations in respiration. Furthermore, a physiological system may be the source domain for understanding more than one emotion, so that the same metaphorical language might be used to describe different emotions. In addition to these more common physiologically based metaphors, there are other metaphors for anxiety that do not appear to be grounded in physiological system. E.g., I think I'm going nuts, I'm going out of my mind, I'm coming unraveled, and I'm coming unglued. For the most part, our understanding of emotions is grounded in the physiological processes that are conventionally thought to be found with those emotions. Therefore, the examples previously discussed supply evidence of an experiential correlation between bodily experience and their mental counterparts, i.e., between the physiological accompaniments of emotions and our attempt to understand, organize, and reason about our emotions. So let's go into the main point here. Anxiety as inhibited breathing. And I think all of you have felt that at times. People with burnout syndrome are feeling it on a daily basis, hourly basis, or several times an hour. For our normal people, maybe it's more seldom, but you will have felt it. And as an extended case, consider the way our understanding and experience of mental disquietude, anxiety, or tension broadly conceived, is partially structured, partially because there are many other metaphors for anxiety, by our experience of constricted breathing. The conceptual metaphor is mental disquietude is inhibited breathing. In which we understand one domain of experience, mental disquietude, in terms of part of our non-metaphorical understanding of another domain, inhibited breathing. For example, she was choking with anxiety. His job was suffocating him. Mary choked on the test. Now the ordeal is over. He can breathe easy. Awaiting the test results, she was breathless with anticipation. I need some breathing room. He went to get some air. He had to take a breather. Well, that's a breath of fresh air. This particular bodily based metaphor for anxiety was chosen because it is the most physiologically significant understanding of anxiety that we have. The close relation between breathing and anxiety is well established in psychological literature. Almost 100 studies have been published in the last decade. However, the breathing-anxiety relation is still being studied almost exclusively from the standpoint of breathing therapy and retraining, with no effort at all to explore the deeper experiential pairing between breathing and anxiety. Nevertheless, there is a strong experiential grounding for this metaphor. The close relation between inhibited breathing and anxiety is commonplace in Gestalt psychology, for example, in which it has been thought, perhaps, to be anxiety's essence. Pearls and Godman argued that suppression of excitement produces the breathing difficulty, which is anxiety. According to Pearls, the root of anxiety is a very simple psychosomatic event. Anxiety is the experience of breathing difficulty during any blocked excitement. Pearls theorized anxiety as caused by the unhealthy suppressing our need to increase breathing rate and amplitude during times of excitement, primarily in an attempt to create the illusion for himself and others of being unmoved, of remaining calm and collected, self-controlled. Pearls contended that anxiety develops in all cases in which an organism undergoes oxygen deprivation. Such deprivation, he observed, is culturally conditioned. For example, whereas fearful situations are common and normal in our society, no strong person wishes to reveal fear by panting or gasping. And this established the close connection between fear and anxiety. The emotion of anger is also culturally conditioned. We learn to hold our breath when angry. This serves the function of denying the excitement is fuel, oxygen, and also choking back what would be expressed if one permitted free exhalation. Even an upcoming pleasant event may give rise to anxiety when, for example, we say we are breathless with anticipation. The anxiety occurs when we try to rein in the excitement within the limits of decorum. Freud calls this instinct anxiety, caused by constricting an organism's necessary functions. Pearls concluded that the anxiety, the excitement, was suddenly muscularly dammed up, continues to shake for a long time till one can breathe freely again. Levin likewise observed that in an atmosphere of intense anxiety, breathing may become extremely difficult and possibly painful, threatening our very survival. Because of this prominent experiential correlation between anxiety and inhibited breathing, this specific bodily based metaphor for conceptualizing anxiety, mental disquietude is inhibited breathing, is more psychologically significant than other bodily based metaphors for anxiety. Breathing and consciousness. Another reason for emphasizing the inhibited breathing metaphor for anxiety over others is that the phenomena of breathing has metaphorically structured Eastern and Western understanding of consciousness for thousands of years. For example, consider the following statement by James. Although he makes no formal argument to this effect, James thought our experience of breathing to be the origin of the treatment of consciousness as an entity. Quote from James. I am confident as I am of anything that in myself the stream of thinking is only a careless name for what, when scrutinized, reveals itself to consist chiefly of the stream of my breathing. Breath, which was ever the original of spirit, is, I am persuaded, the essence out of which philosophers have constructed their entity known to them as consciousness. So William James made a very clear equalization between breathing and soul. And Atma, the Indian term, has its roots in breathing. Atman is the breath. This is very interesting. Hence James sees our concept of consciousness as structured metaphorically by our experience of breathing. On first sight, James' contention may seem nonsensical, but he is simply stating a centuries-old fact about our metaphorical understanding of mind. The words mind, soul, breath, and wind are very closely related. The Greek term psyche literally means breath or wind, but metaphorically it means spirit, soul, mind. The Greek pneuma, the Latin spiritus and anima, the Hebrew ruach, the spirit, breath or breeze that moves over the waters in Genesis and breathed life into humanity. The Sanskrit prana means the incoming air, but it also means life and vital breath. It is the body of Brahman and the animator of our bodies. Many other languages, even wholly unrelated ones like Japanese and Arabic, share what I call mental functioning is breathing. Romantic poetry offers a vivid portrait of the mental functioning, how it has been understood in terms of bodily functioning of breathing. A brief analysis in the spirit of Turner's work on metaphor analysis in literary criticism will be helpful. The Latin spiritus, from which we derive inspiration, respiration, meant wind, breath, or soul. Therefore, to be inspired is to be breathed into by a spiritual force. The metaphorical structure can be understood as involving the minor framework of Reddy's conduit metaphor, in which ideas are objects allowed to flow, unfettered and completely disembodied, into a kind of ambient space between human heads. In Wordsworth, Book 1, for example, ideas are objects flowing from the sweet breath of heaven, divine mind, to a corresponding breeze, the mind of the poet. Wordsworth, in describing his inspiration, records that he was singled out for holy services, came spontaneously to clothe in priestly robe. Ideas are breathed from the Holy Spirit, flow through an ambient space, and are clothed to whatever small extent possible, in words by the elected poet. Nature plays through the artists, just as the wind plays through chimes. The poetic mind is an Aeolian harp, after the god Aeolus, god of winds. Playing nature's music, this is from Shelley. West wind, thou breath of autumn's being, is a more naturalistic version of this model of inspiration. The metaphor for anxiety being explored, therefore, has significance beyond the secondary project of fleshing out one of many bodily-based metaphors for anxiety. The analysis taps into the general cognitive model for both anxiety and consciousness. Mental functioning is breathing. Mental disquietude is inhibited breathing, is a sub-metaphor of mental functioning is breathing. Thus, when inspiration has again been breathed into this formerly anguished, sterile soul, Wordsworth declares, I breathe again. If mental functioning is breathing, then inhibited breathing is, metaphorically, inhibited mental functioning. Even more important in our culture, however, is that there is a certain model of mental functioning implicit in conceptualizing the mind in terms of breath. This model involves the flow of ideas in the mind as conceived along the lines of Reddy's conduit metaphor. Analysis of the metaphor, the emergence of metaphorical understanding. We all share the bodily experience of breathing with its accompanying constrictions and ambient conditions. Considering the following three cases of mental disquietude that, when taken together, show how we move from the bodily connection between anatomical constriction of our breathing and the anxiety that this produces to the metaphorical construction of anxiety as inhibited breathing. Whenever our breathing is inhibited, we experience tremendous anxiety. Consider the experience of food or drink going down the wrong way. Here's a quote. I cough and feel pressure in my upper body, head, throat and chest. I'm emotionally overwhelmed and a bit lightheaded. I clutch my chest and I loosen my collar. Meanwhile, my eyes are watering and my face contorted. The longer this inability to breathe persists, the greater my anxiety grows. I strain to restore normal breathing and gasp in air at the first possible moment, acutely aware of the ambience which has been partially restored. When I say, "Whoo, I can breathe again," I am asserting a fact about my physical functioning. Consider a second case in which I might also say, "Whoo, I can breathe again," though this time following a period of anxiety. Although breath is used here in extended sense to cover mental functioning, some of the physical symptoms mentioned beforehand still apply. In his Principle of Psychology, James offered insight into the mental-physical connection, the bodily basis for a metaphorical projection from our experience of breathing into feelings of disquietude. Here is a quote from his book. "My glottis is like a sensitive valve, intercepting my breath instantaneously at every mental hesitation or felt aversion to the objects of my thought, as quickly opening to let the air pass through my throat and nose, the moment the repugnance is overcome." End of quote. For example, before someone I love is released from surgery, I may be breathless with anticipation or choking with anxiety. The air may be thick, leading me to loosen my collar and ask for some breathing room. Perhaps I'm even suffocating and have to get some air. Or take a breather, but a breath of fresh air makes it possible for me to breathe easy and to think again. Therefore, we see a correlation in our experience between breathing and feelings of disquietude between the body and mind. And compare the words anguish, anxious, and anxiety. The Latin words angere, to choke, angustia, narrowness. Literally. Moreover, the conceptual metaphor can be extended even further to situations in which there is no apparent physiological correlation. That is, where no actual inhibition to breathing occurs. For example, you might suffocate through a long meeting and need to get a breath of fresh air. In suggesting that you suffocated, you're not talking about your physical functioning. You are saying something about your mental functioning, that your cognitive abilities were cut off. Note that the conceiving an event as suffocating will affect behavior, quite possibly leading even a person suffering no apparent physical distress to seek fresh air. Johnson has recently argued that metaphor is the locus of our imaginative exploration of possibilities for action. Very good. That is, possible alternative courses of action emerge for us because the metaphors through which we conceptualize a problematic situation lends itself to these possibilities. For example, what if I understood anxiety as something that hunted me down and stalked me as a prey, instead of attempting to restore normal functioning by getting a breath of fresh air? If I were being stalked, the sensible response would be to flee the cause of anxiety, or else to fight it. Hence, The possible causes we have for action are deeply constrained and directed by the metaphors through which we live. As we move from actual constricted breathing to anxiety conceived metaphorically as constricted breathing, we notice how a metaphor for a mental state can be grounded in bodily experience, even though the metaphorical understanding may have no bodily manifestations or accompaniments. In the example about food going down the wrong way, bodily distress and a felt anxiety is caused by actual physical constriction that results in the loss of breath, in which the constriction is not a result of mental disquietude. In an example about anguish in a hospital waiting room, an actual constriction of air is experienced as accompanying an experience of anxiety. This time, however, the constriction is a result of anxiety, an emotion that may have loss of breath as a physiological accompaniment. In this example, we find an experiential pairing of inhibited breathing with mental disquietude. This correlation gives rise to the conceptual metaphor by way of metonymy. Inhibited breathing is frequently found with anxiety in our shared experience, motivating inhibited breathing to stand for anxiety, forming the very basis for our metaphorical projection. And I think here we see interesting parallels with both Richard E. Lind, where in modern time we don't in the same way relate thinking to breathing. We don't make it metaphorically real. Thinking is not going on anymore. It's no longer an act. It doesn't have an embodiment or a physicality. And of course that physicality is needed to make thinking substantial, correct, functioning, being of value. And here it's a very nice parallel to Richard E. Lind, who says, we lost intellect, we lost inspiration, we lost creativity. What did happen in the post-Greek world? Well, we stopped using physical terms. We stopped metaphorically say that breathing, thinking, inspiration, spirituality, pneuma, intention are actual things. Instead, we made them unreal. And if it goes for embodied cognition and embodied realism, thereby we make them into nothings, into nothingness. And I would say what happens is tensing of the body. It's a constricted movement, and I think that is conventional. It is the same in everyone, because we share this blocking out. And I think there is a connection here to the system of John Appleton, a way of sort of bringing together concepts with their reality, concept with their physicality in the body, and a thinking that is not breathing, according to Wordsworth and Shelley, is no thinking at all. And interestingly enough, most people, even I shouldn't say, but when I first encountered Lakoff Johnson in the early 2000s, I think it was, no, it was early, 97, I was shocked, and I thought, all my concepts are being reduced to the body, and therefore they don't have the same value anymore. It felt like an inflation, like my money on the bank sort of disappeared. And to be honest, I wasn't so happy with that idea. although I really like the general concept. I saw the logic to it, but it wasn't something nice. And this is one of the reasons in the beginning one need to trod carefully. But I now realizing by not making thinking, inspiration, soul, bodily, we make them into nothingness. They need to be related to the real world, because these things were real in our culture, and to a certain extent they are still real in many cultures, like the Indian ones. Thinking for an Indian is something that is actually going on. I think that is the reason why they score so high in proficiency tests, and they sort of block out the IQ test. But even more so in their economy going upwards this way, they really put their thinking where the money is. Yeah, Kalle.
In the beginning of this lecture, you mentioned examples like heated argument, and I'm interested in this metaphor because of Heraclitus. Heraclitus, he uses often fire. So, do you think there is any relation? Heated argument is of course an English expression to Heraclitus' conception of fire.
I think there. I won't even go into how many correlations I actually think there are. That will digress the lecture. I would say definite yes. I need to put my foot down and really emphasize that this is a definite yes to that. I think Lakoff-Johnson is another approach to what Richard E. Lind suggests indirectly. And this is a more lenient way to get into the thinking of Richard E. Lind. I will return to Richard E. Lind maybe in a couple of weeks or months or something like that. But it makes it easier. It makes a segue, as I said before, because these are things, both the Lakoff-Johnson and the Richard E. Lind takes time to understand. But I more than ever understand now what I used to do with my conception, all that, was to make them completely unreal, devaluing them. And now I feel concepts that I use are not as lacking in value anymore. I will finish this off when we go to the cut to the chase.
Can you repeat the name of the article? Who wrote
It will be in the description as well,
Okay,
of course. Give me a sec here. Stephen A. Fessmeyer, Air writing the mind, the metaphor of mental functioning as a bodily functioning.
Oh, this was complicated. Firemeyer.
I will put in a link into the description.
Firemeyer sounds very fiery.
No, Fessmeyer.
Fessmeyer. So we
Close
think
enough.
about party.
Yeah.
We think about party man.
Finally, in the example about suffocating during a meeting, there is neither any apparent physical constriction of breathing nor any apparent emotional distress. This is an explicitly metaphorical case. The metaphor that maps mental disquietude to physical disquietude has clearly emerged. In our everyday understanding, the experiential basis from which our metaphorical understandings merge is not obvious, leading many to think that human rationality somehow transcends our bodily experience. On the contrary, the previous examples suggest that we can speak of our understanding of an emotion as being on a continuum that runs from the emotion's physiological dimension to its cognitive dimension. The terms physiological and cognitive are therefore employed only as functional or teleological distinctions, as opposed to ontological or epistemological distinctions. I think that could be something to be remembered. They are physiological and cognitive things, and as such they are functional or teleological. I would say putting all those things into the body, into the heart, soul, will also make them real and teleological. It's very hard to think of a concept for me nowadays without thinking of it as teleological. It would lose its anima otherwise, its direction. The use of the linguistic expressions like suffocating or choking with anxiety is not arbitrary. If metaphors was just linguistic expressions, we would expect different linguistic expressions to be different metaphors. This is on Lakoff. Hence, he needed a breath of fresh air, the job was suffocating, and she choked on the exam, would constitute three substantially different metaphors. However, we are dealing with only one systemic conceptual metaphor. It is a unified way of conceptualizing disquietude metaphorically that is realized in many different linguistic expressions. Metaphor is not a figure of speech, but a mode of thought. Very important. Or modus, Stimmung. Therefore, contrary to the prevailing folk theory of emotions, a study of the metaphors for emotions gives evidence that they are not just matters of subjective feeling. They have a conceptual content that allows us to see why someone who's suffocating with anxiety probably needs to get a breath of fresh air, and why someone in anguish cannot breathe freely. Also as shown, the conceptual metaphor mental disquietude is inhibited breathing is grounded in our bodily functioning, suggesting that metaphors are given direction, constrained by the experience from which they evolved. Our bodily experience structures the metaphors, and the metaphors give meaningful form to our bodily experience. What background structure is operative when we conceptualize a job or a relationship as suffocating, or when we choke on an exam? What metaphorical mapping underlies Dostoevsky's description in Crime and Punishment of the anguish of the murderer Raskolnikov? Yes, a means of escape I had come. I had been too stifling, too cramping. The burden has been too agonizing. A lethargy had come upon him at times. From the moment of the scene with Nikolai at Porphyry's, he had been suffocating, penned in without a hope of escape. This metaphorical mapping involves a very general mapping of conceptual metaphor. Mental functioning is bodily functioning. As sub-metaphor of the mind is the body. In order to see the mapping, mental disquietude is inhibited breathing, must be seen as a specific instance of the generic metaphor mental functioning is breathing. The basic ontological correspondences are as follows. Flow of air is flow of ideas. Constricted airflow is disrupted flow of ideas. Inhibited breathing is mental disquietude. Restored airflow is revived free flow of ideas. The model of mental functioning implied in understanding the mind in terms of breath involves in our culture the flow of ideas in mind, as been observed in the romantic model of inspiration involves a breath of wind that breathes poetic ideas into the previously sedentary mind of a poet who clothes the idea in priestly robes. This model presupposes a metaphorical understanding of ideas as objects that can flow just as breath flows. Metaphors involving the flows of ideas continue to flourish in our cultures, as Reddy showed in the conduit metaphor. Put your thoughts into words. Your words carry no meaning. How apt. Your words carry... We were talking earlier about empty concepts. This is your words carry no meaning. It's when people say exactly the same and their words are carrying zero meaning. And I would say that the status of the closing of the Western mind, according to, what's his name now? Bloom. Alan Bloom. The minor framework, however, allows ideas and feelings to flow, unfettered and completely disembodied, into a kind of ambient space between human heads. Examples: interesting ideas just seem to pour out of him. B. Don't let your feelings flow out so freely. C. All these thoughts can't gush forth at once. This is the airflow of ideas. This is the unconstricted breathing, which is also creativity. I will not bring in the neurological evidence for this. That will be a later lecture. It will be too disparate to bring it in now. But let me just remind me, there is an enormous amount of people not breathing freely, not being able to either think consistently, not understanding where they are located in their thinking, and they are much less creative, if creative at all. If your breathing is severely constricted, you just act like a robot, doing the things you did the day before or the moment before. You become something lower. And once more, I see a fantastic parallel to Richard E. Lind. Losing one's soul means to fall into animistic or animal way behavior. And what does animal do? Well, they are like mice or rats, doing the same thing every day. They don't have much creativity. What we say, that they have to follow instinct. And I would say the Homo sapiens sapiens, as we are named, should be changed to Homo instinctus. We just act by instinct. And far from the general belief, and I would say that was a belief I shared earlier on as well. I think everyone does that. The general consensus is that instinct is situated in the body. Instinct comes from head consciousness. Head consciousness is, as Richard E. Lind is pointing to, it's an incredibly repetitive thing. And neither words nor thoughts bear any meaning. And the last comparison I have to make is Heidegger, Danken and Denken. He says in Sein und Zeit that modern thinking is unthankful. It doesn't have gratitude, it doesn't have grace, it doesn't have those qualities of meaning something, being valuable. So that concludes the theoretical part of this. I say thank you very much. This would be put on YouTube as 1131. The following will be named 1131b. Okay, you can stop it completely. Oh, you have a question? Sorry.
No, I wanted to only say that the last insight was great, that we are not the Homo sapiens, but the instinctive man. That we are led by our instincts that are in the head. And So that was brilliant. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you so
thank
much.
you.
Thank you.